Hi, my name is David King, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you to this crazy place. Welcome you into this home. I actually don't have to wear this. And for the next few days, I know you're going to be sitting in your homes watching this Global Youth Leadership Conference move forward. It's an interesting thing that they have those two hands up there. I can't tell looking at that if those are grasping in friendship or in arm wrestling. Often in a global conference, that's the real question. How much of this is competitive? How much is collaborative? Welcome to Knovva Academy. Welcome to this few days of fun. I'm stopping in to say hello to you right now at the very beginning so that you can be prepared and I can be prepared when we meet again on June 6th. There are a series of topics that you're going to be hearing about. Global trade, peace and security, education, energy, and on the final day on Saturday, June 6th, we'll spend time together. I'll take as many questions and comments from you as possible. I'll try to answer as honestly and forthrightly as I can. But I wanted to spend time right now to help put things in a little bit of perspective so that we can make the best use of our time together on Saturday. Because I'd like you to know about something that you learn in any basic policy school. Policy School 101 will begin with an overview of policy process models. And I'm going to show you just one model. It's my own personal way that I try and keep in mind the entire sweep of how a policy comes from an idea to actually enactment and then modifying it again. And as you think across the four policy areas over the course of the coming week, I'd like you to be drafting your own policy process model. You don't have to copy mine. Come up with one that works for you. If you simply search for images of policy process models, you might find a search result that looks a little bit like this. But the one I'll be talking about, policy process models, is fairly idiosyncratic. We start off in a world, of course, of conditions, because everywhere around us is a set of conditions that we are blind to. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to do Magic Eye. There are these fun little books. That is a magic eye right there, and if you stare into the screen long enough, or you know how to look into a magic eye, you'll be able to see maybe a mermaid, maybe something else. You are surrounded in this world by conditions that 100 years from now, your great-grandchildren will say, oh my goodness, it was such a problem, and they didn't see it. It was right in front of them. There's a process by which conditions get defined as problems. When we start to see the world in a different way, when we say, my goodness, the economic discrepancies are terrible, or why can't we treat people more equitably, or what are the things that you might be thinking about as conditions in your policy space that need to be thought of as problems? And the first step in my policy process model is how somehow things get on an agenda. They get nominated in a way that some legislative body or some administrative agency will say, my goodness, now we have to pay attention to this problem. Usually things get on an agenda when there's a window of opportunity that opens up. There is a crisis, there is a hurricane, there's a pandemic, or we've run out of money for a problem to solve something. There's a brief window in time, the window of opportunity, that is opened up. Sometimes you can predict when a window of opportunity might actually open up. For example, if there's a budget cycle for your problem, then you're going to run out of money and you know that there's going to be a crisis. Sometimes as an activist, you might want to nudge the window open a little bit. Things get on an agenda in clever ways, often now with the use of social media, trying to get people to recognize, my goodness, it's not simply a condition, but it's a real problem. For a long time, for example, in New York City, 150 years ago, There was a lot of violence towards children. Children were beaten by neighbors, by teachers. It was simply just a thing. But a group of women thought it ought to be identified as a problem. Same time in New York City, there were organizations that were trying to take care of animals on the street, pets and dogs. And they had a society for the prevention of cruelty to animals. Well, after a particularly abusive moment, when children were really hurt, these women went to the newspapers and asked a simple question. They said, why do we treat our pets better than we do our children? And in a moment, in a flash, people started to see that condition, what they'd always expected, become defined as a problem. Are you, as a young person on this stage, focused on the world of conditions that need to be thought of as problems? Or do you already have a problem that you're going to be looking for a solution? In almost any policy community, and across regime types, democratic systems, non-democratic systems, you will find two types of people in groups, two types of people in a legislature, in an agency, in a bureau, in an administration. There are some who are focused on problems. They say, my goodness, if only everyone would pay attention to this problem. And then there are others who seem to always have a solution. In the United States, for example, we have a light rail industry. The light rail industry is always looking for problems. So if somebody says, my goodness, we have a problem with how congested our roads are, the light rail people say, I know the answer. The answer is light rail. Or you might say, well, we have such a dependency on foreign oil, and look what it's done in terms of our trade deficits. The light rail people say, oh, I know the answer. It's light rail. Always be aware, in any policy space, who are the folks who are identifying problems, and do those solutions actually work for that particular problem? There are all kinds of people who have their favorite solution. Now, where I have this little box, problems are analyzed and solutions are developed or not, in my world, that's done in a legislature. That's where I spend my time. It's how I know that it operates. And there's this cycle as you try and attach solutions onto problems that are being analyzed. The outcome of that, again, whether it's a legislature, an administrative agency, whatever it is that policies are adopted or not. Public policies, which are supposed to be solutions to the problems that have gotten on the agenda as we've redefined conditions as problems. So, when we are creating these policies, very often the process of sorting through solutions doesn't accurately address or perfectly address the problems. And in my part of the world where I'm focusing on legislatures, so much of our energy is just on trying to get a bill out of committee or get a bill, passed and signed by the governor or the president. We don't think very long and hard about the next stage of the policy process. And that is that these solutions have to be implemented. Every government has an existing bureaucracy. These agencies were developed to do this. And suddenly there's a new policy that they're asked to try and deal with. Well, the existing bureaucracy is probably not well aligned to be able to implement the solutions that have been offered up. There's a stickiness to a bureaucracy. There's a history and a tradition, a way of doing things. So whatever the policies are, they need to get implemented, and sometimes those implementation is going to be very poorly done. But once it's implemented, there are going to be consequences. And you've all heard about unintended consequences. It's like we've come up with a new policy, we've implemented it, and suddenly something goes wrong. They were unintended consequences. Unintended consequences are not the same things as consequences that can't be anticipated. And one of the great tragedies of policymaking all across the world is that we don't look very far into the future. If you're designing a program, we don't necessarily think hard about who's going to be implementing it, how it's going to be paid for. Unintended consequences happen, but what I want you to do is focus on decreasing the amount of unanticipated consequences. So a program has been adopted, it's been implemented, there are consequences, and the next step is very important. You absolutely have to evaluate whether the solutions worked or they didn't work. Because anytime you're changing the policy space, you need to be able to tinker with it. Just like you know for computer programming. Did anyone ever write a computer program that worked perfectly the first time around? No, it's a constant process of iteration and change and adaptation. But with something as large as a public bureaucracy, it's very difficult to do. Solutions have to be implemented, and then they have to be evaluated, and you need to get it back on the agenda. We also realize that anytime there are consequences, you're changing the world as we know it. In unanticipated ways, certainly there are going to be new conditions and then new problems that arise. So that's the broad scope of a policy process model. It's one that works for me because when I'm dealing with a legislature, I have to force myself to remember, I got to think about what the bureaucrats are going to do with this. And we have to program into the laws the actual evaluations and reporting back into the system so that they can be changed. Now, if you're looking at global connectivity and trade, who are the policymakers there? Where are your moments of leverage? Where are you in a policy process? If you're looking at education and jobs, you are probably thinking about a fairly domestic situation. But if you're looking at peace and security, you're looking at truly global cooperation and antagonism. Energy and the consequences there for climate change are broadly global, and yet our nation states are highly competitive with each other over the costs of production. I need you now to think about drawing your policy model, one that fits for the 4 policy things you'll be watching over the next week. And when we meet again on June 6th, I'd like to hear whether you think of those fists as grasping in cooperation or in the midst of a true arm wrestling competition. And I would love to hear what you're thinking about for your policy process models. Thank you very much, and I'll see you very soon.